Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joanna Barlas. I'm an associate professor in clinical psychology here at JCU. So this afternoon, I'm going to be introducing you to schema therapy. I'm going to tell you about some research that I've done with postnatal mothers using the schema therapy model, and I'm going to share what I think this means for taking care of your own mental health as a parent. But in the tradition of a qualitative researcher, I'm going to share a bit about myself to start with, to give you the context of my research. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I trained in the UK, and then I worked for 5 years with mentally disordered offenders. I came to Singapore 11 years ago now, and I've been working at JCU all that time. I also do a little bit of private practice at a clinic called Fernhill. I teach on the clinical psychology program, and I do research. So I mostly do qualitative research, which means that I try to understand people's experiences through the stories that they tell. In my quantitative research, which I do a little bit of, I mostly do schema therapy research, which means I'm very interested in understanding how people's past experiences shape their thinking and feeling patterns as they age into adulthood. Then finally, I became a mother myself, twice over in the past 8 years. And I guess it was that kind of piqued my curiosity about could I apply my research lens of schema therapy to the experience of parenthood? And particularly looking at how our own experiences of being parented might impact our own parenting and our mental health in parenthood. So I'm not a parenting expert. I don't work with children clinically. In my private practice, I work with adults, typically using schema therapy. But I do, so what I'm going to talk about here applies to the mental health of parenthood, but you might pick up something about your own parenting along the way. So for me to explain how experiences of being parented can impact us throughout the lifespan, I'm going to introduce you to schema therapy. Most people have heard of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. This is based on the idea that our thoughts in any given situation impact how we feel and what goes on in our body, which in turn impacts the kind of things we do in response to that situation. And I'm going to give you an example about how two people can react very differently to the same ambiguous situation. So take Jan. Jan's working from home. He receives an email from his boss after the successful completion of a project asking him to meet with her tomorrow. Jan's first thought is, wonder what that's about. I guess that project went pretty well. Maybe I could be up for promotion. Thinking that, he feels happy and excited, and in his body, he feels alert and energetic. He responds by emailing his boss back immediately to confirm the meeting. Now consider Justin. Justin receives a similar email from his boss, but this time his thought is, oh no, what did I do? Maybe I did something wrong. I bet she's angry with me. Oh God, what if I get fired? Thinking that, he feels anxious and probably a little sad, and he notices that his heart's racing faster and he's trembling. He can't bring himself to respond immediately, so instead he goes to the doctor, gets an MC, and then emails his boss to tell her that he can't make the meeting because he's sick. The next day, as he continues to ruminate on the idea that he's in trouble, his anxiety worsens. So this is CBT in a nutshell. But what happens, or what can explain the very different reactions of Justin and Jan to the same situation? Now, of course, there could be something about their actual performance to explain why Justin is more worried, but let's assume that their performance is equal. Schema therapy expands upon CBT by taking into consideration what sits behind our moment-to-moment thoughts. And schema therapy in particular looks at the impact of our early experiences on our core beliefs, or schemas as they're called in this model. So I'm going to talk to you about early experiences first. Along with CBT, one of the other influential theories incorporated into schema therapy is attachment theory. So attachment theory states that early relationships with caregivers form the basis for future emotional bonds. parents or caregivers need to provide a secure base from where their child can go out and explore the world. Then, when something scary or distressing happens, the child's attachment system kicks in and they return to their parents seeking safety and comfort. A child is said to be securely attached when the parent meets that need for safety and comfort and helps them manage their emotions through co-regulation. So secure attachment forms the basis of these healthy adult relationships. Building on attachment theory then, schema therapy proposes that we have 5 core emotional needs, which need to be met, or mostly met, in order for us to grow into mentally healthy and functional adults. So there's that first one, the secure attachment to others. We need a safe place to live in, and we need to live with a dependable adult who takes care of us and allows us to form an individual identity where we're aware of our unique capabilities. We also need to be unconditionally accepted and loved. We need to feel safe and secure enough to go out and explore the world. And we need to believe that the expression of our needs and views and feelings is allowed. And we need to believe that we can do this competently. We need to be allowed to play and learn freely without oppressive rules or restrictions. And finally, we need realistic limits. We need to learn to control our urges and behaviors when interacting with others. So when these needs are met in childhood, it is more likely that adaptive schemas develop. But when these needs are not met, maladaptive schemas can develop. So schemas are templates or blueprints that develop in childhood as a way of making sense of the world, our place in the world, and perhaps our relationships with other people as well. Our minds actually need to develop these templates, as otherwise we'd be continually overwhelmed with information that seems new to us all the time. So these templates help us to make quick sense of the world, but they can lead us to have biases or distorted perceptions. So you can imagine a schema is like wearing a pair of sunglasses. Just as the glasses affect what color you perceive the world to be, your schema influences how you interpret new experiences, guiding your expectations and reactions based on your past knowledge. So here's an example of one of the 14 adaptive schemas and one of the 18 maladaptive schemas. So Jan was the man we met who was excited when he received an email from his boss. So it's likely that Jan's needs were met enough during childhood that he values his own accomplishments, he doesn't set unrealistic standards for himself, and he generally thinks that what he's done is good enough. So he goes on to develop a realistic expectation schema. Justin was the man who immediately assumed that his boss would be angry with him because he'd made a mistake. In his case, it's likely that some of his needs were not met enough during childhood, and he sets very high standards for himself which he can never achieve. So he develops an unrelenting standard schema. So let's now look at the kind of things that parents must do or avoid doing if they're to meet the needs of their children in childhood. These core emotional needs can be met through everyday positive and nurturing interactions, such as by parents offering emotional nurturance and unconditional love, being dependable, instilling a sense of intrinsic worth, being playful and emotionally open, supporting our need for developing autonomy, offering age-appropriate autonomy, and instilling a sense of confidence and competence. Parents should try their best to avoid the following parenting behaviors. And these are everyday parenting interactions that are negative or exasperating of these core emotional needs. So these include being degrading and rejecting, being overly punitive, being overly controlling, being emotionally depriving or emotionally inhibiting, focusing on competition and status above all else, and being overly protective or overly indulgent. Now, both of these slides that I've just shown you form the basis of the questionnaires that we used in our research. So one measuring the negative parenting interactions and one measuring the positive parenting interactions. So parents who treat their child as capable while modeling realistic expectations themselves and not punishing small mistakes are more likely to meet the child's need for autonomy and competence, and then provide the foundation for adaptive schemas, such as the realistic expectation schema. Parents who prioritize achievements at the expense of play and send the message that love and acceptance is conditional upon performance thwart the need for secure attachment, play, and spontaneity, and set the stage for maladaptive schemas, such as the unrelenting standard schema. So what impact do these schemas have generally in adulthood? Well, there's been a lot more research about early maladaptive schemas than there have been about adaptive schemas. And this because this construct and the questionnaire to measure it was developed back in the late 90s. So there's been a lot of what we call primary research, and in recent years there's been quite a few systematic reviews collating this primary research. So what this research shows is that adults whose needs were mostly met as children show a reduced level of maladaptive schemas. And in turn, this means that they have better mental health, they're better able to regulate their emotions, they generally have higher self-esteem and are more resilient, and they're more able to form satisfying personal relationships. The adults whose needs were not met as children show greater number and greater severity of maladaptive schemas. Then they're at greater risk of mental health problems. They find it harder to regulate their emotions. They have a poorer sense of identity and are more susceptible to stress. And they struggle more with interpersonal relationships. So the adaptive schemas is a newer construct that kind of came out as we started to move towards positive psychology. So moving away from just focusing on dysfunction and looking to identify things that actually help us function adaptively. But the questionnaire is only about 4 or 5 years old. So there's not as much research, but the research is in the same direction. And that's why we were keen to include it in our research. So given this, we wanted to find out how the schema therapy model might apply to the postnatal period. Because as far as we knew, the model hadn't yet been applied to brand new parents or first-time parents. So myself and a colleague and 3 of our Masters of Clinical Psychology students formed a research team and carried out some research. 4 out of the 5 of us were mothers ourselves. So we knew firsthand how parenting can be full of joys and full of challenges. And professionally, we knew that the postnatal period is a particularly vulnerable time for women's mental health. Women are at an increased risk of developing mental health problems such as depression or anxiety. This transition to parenthood and parental mental health is influenced by a number of different factors. So this includes child characteristics, so such as the baby's health and the baby's temperament. It also includes socioeconomic factors, such as how much social support new parents have, their financial stability, and their access to resources. Cultural factors also play a role, such as the impact of living in intergenerational households and the expected roles of grandparents, as well as the parental characteristics, such as parents' previous life experiences and their own expectations of parenthood. So there is existing research, of course, in this area, and that shows that big trauma, what we call big trauma like childhood abuse, has a negative impact on parental mental health. And there's also been other parenting research using different frameworks that generally shows the detrimental impact of, say, a cold parenting style versus a warm parenting style. So we wanted to build on this and understand the impact of mothers' own experiences of being parented in the ways defined by schema therapy, so using those positive and negative parenting interactions. So we designed and carried out a study with 2 components. We asked new mothers to fill in an online survey. It was a long survey. It had 250 items, so a lot of demographic data we collected, and 4 specific questionnaires. So 2 of these questionnaires related to the parenting interactions. And new mothers had to rate their parents on a scale of 1 to 6 on nurturing items, such as the one in the pink heart there. My mother was very close and at the same time able to see me as my own person. As well as negative items, such as the blue one. My mother criticized me a lot. And our participants had to do this twice. They had to rate their mothers and their fathers separately on each questionnaire. They also had to answer questions about their current mood. For example, how often in the past week they felt sad or miserable. And finally, they had to answer items about how competent they felt in their parenting. Again, rating their agreement on a scale of 1 to 6 of items such as, I honestly believe I have all the skills necessary to be a good mother to my child. So it's important to note here that competence is not an objective measure of competence. We had no way of knowing objectively how competent they were being. It was their subjective experience of how competent they felt. And it included how effective they felt they were being in their parenting and how satisfied they were with their own parenting. So we posted links to this survey on social media groups like Stork's Nest and Young Mothers of Singapore, as well as via in-person support groups such as Mother and Child and Beloved Bumps. I mean, we actually had more than, I think, 400 people open the questionnaire, but given they were new mothers, about half of them didn't actually ever finish it, which I think is understandable. At the end of the survey, we asked if any mothers would be willing to meet with us one-to-one for an interview, as we wanted to ask them open-ended questions and help them explain in their own words how their experience of being parented had impacted their mental health and their own parenting. So this is called a mixed method approach. It means you gather both survey responses, so that's our quantitative data from a larger sample, and stories, the qualitative data from a smaller group. And then it's hoped that by combining these two types of data, you can get a more comprehensive understanding of the issue. So we managed to get 220 new mothers living in Singapore, which we felt was pretty good for a master's level project. They all had an infant under 12 months of age. They were aged themselves between 18 and 44, with an average age of 32 years. 74% of them were of Chinese ethnicity, 80% of them were university educated, and 83% of them were employed. We then managed to interview 25 of these mothers in the one-to-one interviews. Once we had all our quantitative data, we tested some of our demographic variables. What we found was that mother's age was negatively related to depression, and mother's education level was negatively related to depression and positively related to sense of competence. Birth complications were also related to depression, and baby's health problems were negatively related to sense of competence. So we could then control for these variables in our ongoing analyses. Based on previous research, we were not surprised to see that the parenting interactions did have a relationship with both postnatal mental health, so depression, and the parent's sense of competence. And that was both for negative and positive and mothers and fathers parenting. So we wanted to do some mediation analysis. Mediation looks at the relationship between the three variables. In our case, we predicted that the impact of parenting on a new mother's sense of competence would in part depend upon her mood. And again, our predictions were shown to be correct. Mothers who recalled more nurturing interactions with their own mothers or fathers generally felt less depressed and more competent. In contrast, the mothers who recalled more negative interactions with their mothers or fathers generally felt more depressed and less competent. Now, as I shared earlier, we know that there are other influences on mental health. But what this research shows is that the impact of parenting they received in their childhood, continues to exert an influence at a significant level, albeit with what we call small to moderate effect sizes. So our survey data gives us a broad view of what's happening on average among new mothers. It tells us that those mothers who had experienced more negative parenting interactions are more likely to experience depression and more likely to feel less competent as a new mother. But it doesn't say that everyone who had that background would definitely go on to feel depressed. It's about increased risk, not certainty. Survey data can't tell us about individual mothers, and it can't tell us how these experiences impact mood, how people make sense of them, and how people might use the positive interactions in their own parenting. With my other hat as a clinical psychologist, I'm equally interested in people's stories, but also the how, the underlying processes that link these things. And this is where our qualitative data comes in. So remember, the qualitative data comes from 25 mothers from the bigger sample. And one of our research team, one of the students, interviewed each of these mothers over Zoom, because it was COVID time, but in one-to-one interviews lasting around about an hour. So she used an interview schedule which we developed, including questions like this. So thinking back to the ways in which you were parented in general, how has your own experience of being parented affected you as a mother? And how have the ways in which you were parented affected your mental health now you're a mother? And there were other open-ended questions that we used as well. So what we were trying to do was to help these mothers tell their own story of being parented. Each of these interviews was audio recorded and transcribed, as is typical in qualitative research. We then used something called reflexive thematic analysis to analyze all the interview data, which means that we went through each interview and coded the things that each mother said. On the left, you'll see an excerpt from an interview, and on the right, codes that have been applied to each segment of data. So what's a code? So a code is a label or a brief description that captures an important aspect of the data in relation to the research question. So we had no prior agenda when we were coding, which means we worked from the bottom up, and we were sticking closely to what each mother said. We then repeated this coding process for all 25 interviews. These codes then become the building blocks for developing themes during the analysis. And in the next stage of analysis, we looked through all the codes from the interviews and sorted them into groups of similar codes. So what we're looking for at this stage is kind of recurring features or patterns to help us organize and interpret the data. From these groups of codes, we can then generate themes. A theme captures the central idea that links all the codes in that particular group together. And so it conveys the essence of the data, representing any shared meanings or underlying concepts that hang the data together. So you can imagine with 25 women in an hour long each, we had a lot of qualitative data and a lot of different things that were said about parenting. So we actually decided that we'd focus on a particular aspect, initially focus on a particular aspect of parenting. And that's that autonomy and control dimension. So remember, in the pink hearts, we have like 2 positive parenting interactions around granting and supporting autonomy. And in the blue, what are they, explosions, we have the negative parenting interactions, which are about parents being overly controlling or overly protective. And part of the reason we focused on this was that at the subscale level, these particular parenting interactions turned out to be predictive of both depression and sense of competence across the different parents. From our coding of the interviews, we then generated 3 themes, each of which had 2 sub-themes. So the first theme, making sense of autonomy. And this shows us that how these new mothers thought about their past experiences of being parented was more important than the facts of how they were parented, and that their perception of how they were parented could change over time. And also, as parents themselves now, they could choose how they responded to the differing levels of control that they received in childhood. In the second theme, learning to thrive through autonomy, we found that early parenting interactions impacted how these new mothers perceive themselves in terms of their knowledge and skills, and how they manage their own emotions now they were a mother. Finally, in the third theme, striving for balance through autonomy, we saw that the new mother's perception of how much autonomy they were given influenced how much autonomy they were willing to give their own child. And also, those whose needs for autonomy and competence were met seemed to feel more competent in trying out and adjusting different parenting strategies in responding to their child's individual needs. I always think it's quite hard to make sense of a lot of qualitative data, so I tend to kind of pick out examples. So I've got two examples, Jocelyn and Faye, which, don't worry, isn't their real names. We've given them pseudonyms, so protect their confidentiality. So Jocelyn. So we could, after they agreed to participate in the interview, they also agreed to kind of waive their anonymity in the survey responses. So we could match what they said in the survey with the interview. So Jocelyn rated both her parents as being highly supportive of her developing independence and granting her lots of opportunity for autonomy. She also rated both parents as being low on controlling and overprotective behaviors. So within the first theme, Jocelyn made sense of her mother's support of her becoming autonomous and independent as a positive thing, which she then saw as giving her confidence in what she does and how she thinks of herself as an adult. In motherhood, the second theme, this helped her cope with feelings of stress when her baby cried, as she knew not to internalize the child's feelings of distress. Her experience of being parented also helped her to make use of mother support groups, as she grew up with parents who encouraged her to express her feelings, so she was able to do so in times of need. Then, in line with the third theme, in terms of her own approach to parenting, Jocelyn was keen to emulate her mother's approach of teaching her child to do her best and not putting unrealistic expectations on her child. So now let's consider Faye. So Faye represents the mothers who had a more difficult experience of parenthood growing up. Faye rated her mother as moderately supportive and granting of autonomy, not particularly controlling, but highly overprotective. She rated her father as unsupportive of her developing autonomy and moderately controlling. So here, Faye describes how fierce and angry her father was, but at the same time, she still valued his ability to set boundaries. So in her own parenting, the essence of that first theme of being able to select and move on from the childhood experiences, she did want to learn to set boundaries, but just without being so angry when she was doing it. In the past, her father's behavior had left Faye feeling depressed. She's not necessarily talking about motherhood now, she's talking about prior to motherhood. Because as a mother, she was learning to manage her own emotions better with the support of friends. So she's gone from being able to spiral to having this kind of network who she can check in with about whether what she's feeling is normal, and finds that beneficial in learning to regulate her own feelings. Faye described her overly protective mother as impacting her decision making. So because her mother made all her decisions for her, she didn't learn how to make decisions for herself. And in motherhood, this translated into struggling to know how to respond to her baby crying and not feeling able to trust her instinct, and often actually turning to others quite quickly before she could figure out how to do it herself. So what did we learn from this? Well, I guess we already knew that parenting can have a lasting impact on women's sense of self and emotional well-being. And here we learned that these everyday interactions that mothers and fathers have with their children continue to exert an impact when those mothers become mothers themselves, when those women become mothers themselves. We learned that these everyday negative parenting interactions increase the risk of postnatal depression and a lowered sense of competence. And that positive parenting reactions, which has a weaker relationship, maybe can be protective against postnatal depression and leave mothers feeling more competent. From the qualitative data, we learned how we perceive parenting can change across the lifespan. The experience that we have as children can be reframed and rationalized, particularly in adulthood, but as we become parents and realize the challenges of parenting ourselves. We also have some choice over which parenting interactions we choose to use in our parenting and which ones we'll avoid. So overall, it seems as though that how we make sense of parenting, the parenting we received, can be as important as the parenting itself. So if we, and this is my clinical psychology hat coming back on again, if we integrate our qualitative and quantitative findings using the schema therapy model, we can track through the implications of core emotional needs being met or not met for new mothers when they become parents. So this is for mothers like Jocelyn, whose needs were mostly met in childhood. So for Jocelyn, her need for autonomy and independence was met, which meant that she was more likely to go on and develop schemas such as a healthy self-reliant schema. Then when new mothers like this are faced with a triggering situation, such as their baby crying inconsolably, they're more likely to have thoughts such as, I can handle this, I know what to do. They're more likely to feel emotionally calm and alert and attentive in their bodies, which in turn allows them to focus on and attune to their baby, and they feel confident in trying out various different strategies until they find the one that soothes the baby. Because they successfully soothe the baby by themselves in a calm manner, this could then feed back into their general perception of their own competence when they're faced with new situations such as motherhood. For mothers like Faye, whose needs were not fully met in childhood, they're more likely to go on to develop maladaptive schemas, in this case, a failure schema. When these mothers face a situation such as their baby crying inconsolably, their thoughts could be more something like, I don't know what to do, I'm a bad mother, which would leave them feeling anxious and sad, probably more agitated and shaky in their body, and it may mean they are more likely to focus on their own internal states and find it harder to attune to their baby. They're also feel less confident to try more than one soothing strategy. This, of course, is probably going to make it harder for them to soothe their baby, and the baby keeps crying, which then feeds back into the vicious cycle of thoughts and feelings, and may further strengthen their maladaptive schema, so leaving them feeling even more convinced that they're failing at being a mother. So clinically, why do we think our research is important? Well, we think we've there's an importance in even identifying these postnatal depression issues in Singapore, because this was a community sample. This wasn't people who were already accessing support or within clinics or hospital settings. Secondly, we think that looking at factors such as early parenting experiences could help with the early detection of mothers who would benefit from professional support. These interventions could then help them make sense of any negative early experiences they have and improve the quality of their own nurturing parenting interactions with their child. And so we see a knock-on effect to future parents and future children. Given these intergenerational aspects of parenting, it could therefore be helpful to merge postnatal mental health support and parenting support more closely. Because if we can help parents to understand their own core emotional needs, we're actually also helping them to understand how to meet the emotional needs of their child. We're still actually running analyses on our data set. So we collected one more variable, anxiety, which I didn't put in the original slides here. So we're going to be looking next at what is the impact of these early parenting on postnatal anxiety. We're also looking to try to identify which of the specific parenting interactions are most impactful on mental health and sense of competence. And we want to look at the impact of combined parenting. So all our analyses to date, we had to run separately. We ran for mothers, we ran for fathers. But what if you actually had a father who was emotionally supportive and offering unconditional love, and a mother who was highly critical and highly controlling? What is the combined impact of those on mental health and sense of competence? In future research, we want to test pathways in a more comprehensive model. Like from the model that I showed you, tracking through for individual mothers, you'll notice that we've got schemas there. But we didn't have schemas in our simple mediation model. And that was arguably a good or bad decision at the time, but the decision was based on the fact that we didn't want to make an even longer questionnaires for our new mothers. So we thought we'd test this model first, and in future times we can go back and add in other components of the schema model, such as the schemas, and then there are other impacts as well related to how people cope with their schemas. We'd also really like to do some similar research with new fathers, because actually there's quite a lot out there with postnatal mothers, but there really isn't very much with postnatal fathers. So what does this mean for you? I guess whether you're a parent or not. For me, and again, the clinical psychology hat, I think it's worth thinking about and reflecting on the parenting that you had. Think about and reflect on whether your needs were mostly met or unmet as a child. What it doesn't mean is that if you can identify any unmet needs, that you had terrible parents. All of us have some needs that were met and some needs that were unmet. It's hard parenting, and parents are doing the best that they can with the resources that they have in their particular set of circumstances. Maybe it was a struggle for them to meet your physical needs, let alone your emotional needs. And maybe some of their emotional needs weren't met in their own childhood, such as play. So actually, when you were a child, they really had no idea how to be playful with you. What it also doesn't mean is that if you can identify unmet needs, is that you will definitely get depressed. Because of course, it depends how we respond and make sense of it, as we saw from our qualitative data. And finally, parenting is also that one of the factors that influences our mental health during parenthood. So we can also mitigate any impacts through social support, through other resources, through our parenting skills. So we're all going to have different aspects of parenting that come easier and parenting that we find harder. And you might find that the aspects that you find easier mirror the positive ways in which you were parented. So maybe your parents showed their interest in you as a person, not what grades you got at school, not what sport you excelled in. And so now you find it easier to instill a sense of an intrinsic worth in your own child. You can help them believe that they are unconditionally loved and accepted, flaws and all, just because of who they are, not what they are good at. But of course, there'll also be aspects that you find more challenging. And that might be related to trying to meet a need for your child that was not met for you. Or you might be overcompensating for one of your unmet needs. So for example, if you have particularly controlling parents, you might find yourself not imposing any limits at all with your children. But of course, children do need some realistic limits. Or maybe there's something in your everyday interactions that leave you feeling particularly frustrated or anxious. Now, of course, that could be situational. That's why I chose this picture. The end of the day, trying to get kids into bed, like you're just tired, you're hungry at that point in the day. Or it says something about your child's temperament. But if your reaction seems disproportionate and happens repeatedly, it might be saying something about one of your unmet core emotional needs, and it might be triggering one of your schemas. So for example, say you have an unrelenting standard schema. Your need for realistic expectations of yourself and others was never met. So when your kids leave toys in a mess, you immediately get infuriated. You yell at them, you become overly punitive. And this is because it might feel as though having a messy house says something about you and your kids, that you're not perfect in some way. So I've given you some questions to help you reflect on your own parenting and your own whether your needs were met or not. So things like, how available and reliable were your parents? How did they help you develop self-worth? Were they critical or abusive? Do you feel worthy of love and attention? How easy do you find it to play? And can you take care of yourself without guilt or fear? So what happens in schema therapy? Like if you were to go and see a psychologist would help you figure out how to get your needs met in a healthy way now you're an adult. Because of course we don't go running back to our parents and expect them to meet our needs. And so that's kind of things we can do ourselves. So if we feel like a failure as a parent, reminding ourselves that we all make mistakes, and making mistakes does not mean you are a failure. Particularly in parenting, it's how we repair those mistakes with our children that's helpful. If you're going to do that, you're going to need to accept that your children can feel annoyed and disappointed with you, but still love you and think you're a great parent. Of course, we don't all need to go to therapy to resolve any unmet needs. We can talk to our friends and our partners about those. So if you were always discouraged from expressing your feelings as a child, that might be having an impact in your relationship. So letting your partner know and asking for help with learning how to express your feelings, and probably asking for some patience as well, can be helpful. And we can also try out different ways of doing things. So one of a schema that's very common to a lot of clinical psychologists is a self-sacrifice schema, sacrificing our own needs to help other people. Now that's going to be detrimental in parenting because you can endlessly help the small people in your life, but you're going to burn out if you do that. So you might need to learn to kind of stand up against that self-sacrifice schema and figure out how to take care of yourself, how to give yourself space without guilt, without fear, so that you can be a better parent. And of course, if you do really feel like you're struggling with your mood or with how you feel about your own parenting, you can access professional support. Schema therapy is a pretty popular model, so there are quite a few clinical psychologists in Singapore who offer schema therapy. And so just as we come to the end, I'll leave you with a quote and a reminder that parenting is hard. Parents have strengths and struggles. Taking care of your own mental health as a parent is as important as taking care of your children. Except that there are no perfect parents out there. You just need to work on being good enough and also see parenting as a skill that can be learnt. Thank you. So, is it always the case that believing efforts are good enough is realistic? What if efforts really not good enough to meet the requirement? Yeah? Okay. So yeah, there's the QR code. I'll answer these questions in the meantime. So yes, I think that's a fair question. And that's probably, we're branching into another area here, which is compassion. So being compassionate with ourselves means that we shouldn't hold ourselves to incredibly high standards, but it doesn't mean we should have no standards at all. Yes, we do need to put in efforts. And yes, we do need to understand maybe when we are struggling with something, when our parenting really isn't being the most beneficial for our children. And you'll see a lot of the words, you haven't seen all the schemas, but a lot of the words in the adaptive schemas are about realistic expectations of ourselves, realistic standards for ourselves, realistic limits that we set for ourselves. And approaching that compassionately means that we don't beat ourselves up if our efforts really aren't good enough, because that's not really a good motivating force. But we hold ourselves to account and try to be better in whatever it is that we're trying to do. So what can a new mother who doesn't feel that they have a secure or supported need do differently so this won't repeat as another cycle to the child? So yeah, that's a really good question there. And I guess I'm interpreting that in two ways in my head. One might be about that original secure attachment, but one might also be about the social support. So I'll kind of answer both there. So there are actually specific parenting programs that build on this idea. So I didn't invent it. It's not my new idea. I'm just doing some research around it. One of them is called the Circle of Security. So that's a very attachment-based parenting program. And it is that idea that in order to provide a secure attachment base for our children, if we have an insecure attachment ourselves, we're going to find that hard. The other is based on schema therapy. It's relatively new, so the research is very limited at the moment, but it's called the Good Enough Parenting Program. And it was developed by a Malaysian guy and has been run quite a few times in Singapore. And again, that's kind of, schema therapy grew up and was apply to adults looking back on their unmet needs, whereas this guy's kind of flipped it on its head and is like, okay, well, how do we then meet the needs of our children so they don't go on to develop schemas? So that's how we would do it in an attachment type way and looking for that secure base. The other thing I think I'll answer within that question is maybe around social support. So social support is incredibly important for mothers and new mothers. To reduce feelings of isolation, to have that kind of sounding board when you have really no idea what you're doing as a mother, for your own emotional support as well. So that can be an important thing to develop. If that's difficult as well, or think people are really struggling, it might be about finding professional support, at least as a bridge to get someone to a place where they're more able to build social relationships that might be supportive for them. So in the context of Singapore, they're jumping around. To what extent does the pursuit of meritocracy contribute to parenting interactions and child mental health outcomes? Yes, so I think within there, and I guess that's why I put a few of the examples there. So one of the things that we kind of really need to think about is helping people develop a sense of their unique capabilities, their unique strengths, but that doesn't mean to say that everyone needs to be the best at everything. And pushing children to kind of be the best, do the best all the time can have their negative impacts for their mental health. So it's about those realistic expectations, teaching parents to help them find the unique strengths that their particular child has, as well as that foundation of unconditional love and acceptance. Now that can be hard as a parent when your child is like always kicking off about the same thing. But that's the point. Like as humans, we're all flawed. As humans, we all have struggles that we go through. And we need to have at least one person in the world who thinks we're utterly fabulous, whatever it is that we do. Not because of what we're good at or what rewards we can bring to the family. So the next one, not quite a question. Experience with own parents. Perceptions can change even before they become parents. Yeah, absolutely, for sure. No, I would agree with that. I mean, I've focused particularly on the postnatal period, but of course, we're always continuing to make sense of our experiences growing up. So what is the ratio on postnatal depression to those experiencing with negative and positive parenting? So if I can answer that from my own research. So we actually found that the negative parenting has a greater impact on postnatal depression. And that's probably generally because negative things that generally have a greater impact as shown in kind of psychology. There may also be an expectation of positive parenting being like the norm somehow, that's a very base level that we expect. And it may also be as well in relation to a positive parenting that actually we're not got quite the right outcome. So if we're looking for positive parenting, actually maybe if we'd had an outcome related to well-being where people actually kind of feel good about themselves, we might see a stronger relationship there. So what we're seeing is the stronger impact of negative parenting. But if we'd included a well-being measure, we might see the stronger impact than a positive parenting. Overall, positive mental experiences in each early life into adulthood and education in early motherhood could be helpful, yes. So there's this thing about nature versus nurture. Why is it seems like many can't overcome the nature part when it comes to how they were parented? Absolutely. I've in some ways hugely simplified the schema therapy model here because one of the big influences that interacts with how we are parented that leads to people developing schemas is the child's temperament. And that can kind of go round in some kind of vicious circle as well. So someone can have all the good intentions in the world to parent in this really positive way, but the child's temperament actually makes it very hard for them to be parented. And so the parenting becomes more negative or more punitive. And so the child's temperament becomes more difficult, and we get stuck in a vicious cycle there. So yes, I think, and be honest here as well, I probably downplayed the impact of nature in my own mind, being a clinical psychologist, until I had my own children. And then I realized with the two of them, I have two daughters, quite how different they are, and the really different parenting that they need from both me and my husband as well. So yes, I think there it's about, because I haven't really answered the question there, it's about figuring out what that specific child needs within your family, and understanding that actually it's not a blanket approach to parenting. And I think children find this infuriating because children want things to be fair and equal all the time. Whereas actually children need different things from us. And some children need more limits, and some children need fewer limits. And some people need more activities to help them get a sense of intrinsic worth. Some kids are born with like, no, that's fine, I'm great as the way I am. So we just need to be more responsive and flexible in our parenting. So do you have parenting books to recommend? Your last slide about being good enough reminds me of the book Good Enough Parenting, but do you have other books? Yes, I am a big fan of like Good Enough Parenting as well, if it's Dr. Becky. What other ones? I chop around. The other one I've read recently is, and I can't remember the author's name, but it comes from the positive psychology movement. It's the strength-based approach to parenting. So that, again, is this idea that let's move away from trying to constantly erase or somehow rub out the flaws that our children have, and parent them by recognizing their strengths and then getting them to use their strengths to work on the areas that they might find more difficult in life. So I've been a big fan of that book recently. I'll think as I answer the other questions, whether there have been other ones. So what were the most common maladaptive schemas that you found suspect might be present for depressed mothers? So we didn't actually measure schemas in our research here. And there's been a lot, like I said, there's been systematic reviews on this generally, not necessarily specifically for new mothers in adulthood. And basically there isn't a one-to-one relationship with specific schemas and specific mental health problems. So if you look at the kind of systematic reviews in the area, there's 18 maladaptive schemas, and lots of them relate to lots of different mental health problems. So there are a few that might stand out. So defectiveness, so believing you're just not a worthwhile human being. And there's another schema called negativity or pessimism. So those can quite often be related to depression. But actually, for myself as well as a psychologist doing this, I think it's going to start moving away from trying to identify schemas that relate to specific disorders and starting to look at schemas that relate to specific processes, such as emotional regulation, such as flexibility in thinking. So rather than it being, right, this schema means you'll be depressed, this schema means you'll be anxious, this schema means you'll develop bipolar disorder at some point. There just isn't that one-to-one relationship. To what extent does culture and society play a role in the development of healthy and maladaptive schemas? For example, Singapore versus Finland. So there isn't enough research yet on adaptive schemas. There's been a huge amount of research on maladaptive schemas, like I've said, and a lot of this has been cross-cultural. So for the most part, nearly all the schemas exist across all different cultures. When it comes to the development of the different schemas, what we're going to be looking at is maybe the particular parenting practices that might go on in that particular country. So just using other parenting models, and if people might be aware, the kind of more typical Bamran parenting models. So parents can be either authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, or neglectful. Now, generally, what research from the West shows is that it's an authoritative approach to parenting that leads to the best child outcomes. But actually, there is some research that shows within more Eastern cultures that an authoritarian approach to parenting is a kind of good second best there. So authoritarian parenting in Western populations has more negative impacts than it does within Eastern populations. I feel that parenting also depends on one's situation at that point of time. Loss of their dear ones while nurturing their own kids bring anxiety and depression. Yeah, 100% agree. Like, we're not parenting in a vacuum. We have like the rest of life to get on with. So and you know, like I said, there's so many different influences on our mental health. Like the total models that we looked at, like including our demographic variables and the parenting interactions, we're still only looking at maybe around 25%, explaining around 25% of the variation in depression. Now that is significant, but that means there's a whole heap of other stuff that's going to impact mothers' moods during parenting. So yes, I agree. Very difficult to be parenting in those situations if you've got other big life events going on. Have you come across Pop Culture Parenting? Dr. Bill Garvey speaks about the importance of sound attachment early on. I have not, but thank you for the recommendation. Those are all my questions online. Any questions in the room?
Yeah, not really a question, but just relating to the pop culture parenting. Dr. Billy Garvey is a paediatrician in Australia, and he spoke at a conference I was at last week, and just to really blow your mind kind of a presentation in the work that he does with children and parents who are struggling because of various issues in that cycle of abuse and all sorts of things happening to them. And he created pop culture parenting as kind of a sounding board for people to call in and give their examples of, you know, what they're doing. Just a really, very down-to-earth guy, though. And I would recommend, if people are struggling with that, it sounded like a really great one to link into. And some people at the conference said they were already listening. Yeah, and it's good because it sounds very accessible. It's not one of those parenting books that's kind of written up here. It's kind of down, kind of on the ground there. It's a really, it's a kind of a pop culture almost podcast. Yeah. And I think it's true. The other recommendation that was up there is kind of good enough parenting as well, which was a clinical psychologist from the States, but actually started off on Instagram, just posting little videos and little clips and like actually little scripts of what you can say to your kids in specific situations, and then turn that into a book.
Thanks for a wonderful presentation. Just more of a question as a qualitative researcher. What advice would you give early career researchers working in qualitative research and sort of grappling with the mounds of data and trying to generate codes and themes?
Start small, I think would be my first advice. And I think my students maybe are slightly shocked. I've got Catherine here who was very on board with it as well. But everyone always wants to get straight in and use the software. They want to go straight in and use in vivo. And I'm just like, no, let's just go back to good old fashioned, write your codes down the side. And then what I get them do for each interview, print them out on different colored bits of paper and cut them out, and then get a big table and spread them out and sort them and do it very manually and very visually. And I think students look a little bit shocked by this sometimes. Like, what? Why haven't we got software to do this for us? But I think that's for a small data set, let's be clear. If you've got about 50 interviews, you'll just die during that process. But if you've got a small data set, I think that really helps you get to grips with what you are trying to do in qualitative psychology. And it particularly works. So the type of psychology qualitative research I do is phenomenological. So I'm looking to understand people's experiences. And again, getting to that depth can be really helpful if you're doing it by hand. Whereas I find just in vivo, you tends to kind of make you look a little bit more surface level, I think. So that would be my tip for new qualitative researchers. Any more questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming. It's been great that you could all be here. Thank you.